I'm going to start without any further ado. I should say that this is part of what I'm talking about is part of the ERC-funded meta science project, which you can see there on the link, and on my background, my cool meta science logo as the background. There we go. That seems to work. Yeah, the topic is natural kinds, and particularly on this criterion of mind independence that is often mentioned in connection to the thought that we need some sort of objective criterion for the reality of kinds. But this mind independence criterion has also faced some important criticisms, perhaps most significantly from Muhammad Ali Khalidi. And I'm going to be focusing mainly on his critical remarks about the mind independence criterion. Then I'm going to say something about the connection between natural kinds and projectability and entrenchment, projectability in scientific context in particular. And I'm going to finish by talking about how I think we should understand this mind independence criterion for natural kinds, how I think it's still going to be usable by applying it rather than to natural kinds themselves, to the principles that unify the various properties that members of natural kinds have. So that will be the last section of the talk, and the sort of more positive contribution that I'm going to be trying to make today. Okay, so let's get started. I should start by saying something about what I think natural kinds are, although that won't be my key question today. My own view is that a strongly realist view about natural kinds. I think that natural kinds are substantial universals, but that won't really have any sort of a bearing on what I'm going to be saying today. But it is going to be a realist view and a metaphysical view rather than an epistemic view of kinds. That's actually one reason why I'm focusing on Khalidi, because he's also defending a metaphysical view of natural kinds rather than a purely epistemic view, like some contemporary philosophers of science do. So one thing you could say is that natural kind terms are the set of concepts that we use to refer to something like mind-independent joints of reality. And I think that this thought is already captured by some famous passages from J.S. Mill, such as the one you can see on the screen. He says, "Insofar as a natural classification is grounded on real kinds, its groups are certainly not conventional. It is perfectly true that they do not depend upon an arbitrary choice of the naturalist." And I think that this is something that we should uphold. So natural kinds capture something objective in the world rather than arbitrary choices. But the problem is that many scientific classifications that we regard as being successful and useful may not be fully mind independent. And nevertheless, insofar as these scientific classifications are useful and they capture something like generalization that can be used to make predictions, so they are projectable, then many people, many philosophers of science would want to regard these scientific classifications as natural kinds. So we have this initial conflict here, and that is one of the main reasons, not the only one, but one of the main reasons why this mind independence criterion has recently come under severe criticism. So here are some examples: Laura Franklin Hall, Muhammad Ali Khalidi, as I mentioned, and Mark Arachevsky. Now, I have a longer version of the paper than I'm able to give today, where I discuss also briefly Franklin Hall's and Arachevsky's comments on this. But Franklin Hall is actually defending a type of anti-realism about kinds, or it can be construed as such, and Arachevsky is defending an epistemic view of natural kinds. So they do not fit my purposes quite as well as Khalidi is, who is defending a metaphysical view of natural kinds. So that's one reason to focus on Khalidi. So there's another thing that I want to preface this talk with, and that's something that can also be traced back to Mill, and that's the relationship between natural kinds and the properties that we use to characterize them. So the properties that come together in members of natural kinds. So Mill makes this type of observation as well, that it's important that we are able to distinguish between natural kinds and mere groups of objects that are characterized by a shared natural property or a number of shared natural properties. So you might think that chemical substances are a fairly plausible example of natural kinds, whereas something like being acidic or just being green and round might be merely shared natural properties. So they wouldn't be natural kinds even if they are sometimes grouped together. So the question then is, which clusters of properties correspond to real kinds? Well, my view is that properties that are systematically clustered together in members of natural kinds do so because the particulars instantiating these clustered properties are members of certain natural kinds. So that enables us to distinguish between two questions, what I'm calling the why and the how question about this issue. So the why question is what I've just told you about the systematic clustering of properties, but there is the how question, namely, how are the various properties that are clustered together related? What unifies these properties? So take something like a plausible natural kind, perhaps fundamental natural kind, electron. Its properties are a certain rest mass, spin, and charge. So how are these properties clustered together, and why are these properties clustered together? Well, the why question in this case is just that these properties are clustered together because the members are members of a natural kind electron. But the question of how in this regard is much more difficult, and I will return to this. But here we get to the positive part as well, which I'll return to later, which is to say that these principles, what I call unification principles, that we may tell, well, that tell a story, if you like, about how these properties are clustered together. So I'm just collectively calling these unification principles, and I'll give you some examples. Perhaps the clearest example could be regarded as something like Richard Boyd's very well-known homeostatic property cluster, the HPC theory. So in this case, the clustering of properties, according to the HPC theory, is explained by a shared causal structure among the members of a natural kind. So each member of a kind would be a property cluster that's kept in homeostasis by a lower level causal mechanism of some sort. And this is, of course, famously applied to biological cases, but it doesn't work quite as well in some other cases. I'm not going to go into the details of the theory, but what I'm regarding as an example of a unification principle are each of these type of causal mechanisms, for instance. So they would answer the how question regarding, say, the clustering of certain properties in members of biological species. So that's just one example, but actually this talk or this paper isn't focused on detailing these various unification principles. That's an interesting question. It's partly a scientific question to figure out these unification principles, but I'm more interested in applying the mind independence criterion to this thought of unification principles. So I'll be focusing on that issue here. Happy to talk about it in Q&A in more detail. Okay, so sometimes we should acknowledge it may be very difficult to determine what the relevant unification principle is. So the epistemology of this issue may be very complicated. Sometimes that might be because there's just no objective unification principle for a putative natural kind. And that would mean that the kind in question on this idea would not be a real natural kind. So there needs to be an objective unification principle for the properties of these supposed kinds, if that kind is going to be a real natural kind. That's the thought of respecting Mill's criterion. But sometimes it can just be difficult to find that unification principle because we just haven't done the science yet, or because there are several candidate unification principles and we don't know which one is the correct one. But the key here is that the principle, if the kind is to be real, must be mind independent. Otherwise, it would indeed be very easy to identify it, as it would just be based on these arbitrary choices, what Mill called arbitrary choices, on what we deem to be of interest. So it's very easy to say that these things come together if we are interested in them. So there's no objective principle in nature, as it were, that is going to combine these properties. All right, so some examples that I'll give further down the line will make this a bit clearer. But let me get to the maybe the central topic of this talk, which is this problem of supposedly mind-dependent kinds. So kinds that some might regard as real natural kinds, but which feature some form of mind dependence. So I have previously said myself that natural kinds reflect natural divisions in mind-independent reality. So I've been committed to this type of mind-independence criteria. But people like Khalidi have then pointed out that there are these kinds that are clearly, in some sense, mind-dependent, but which we would surely want to regard as if not clearly real kinds, that at least clear candidates for real kinds. And here are some examples: Einsteinium, the element with atomic number 99, psychological kinds, perhaps, such as depression, social kinds, such as money, and the list goes on. Especially in high-level sciences, we get clear candidates for this. So if we want to make this sort of distinction, we are going to need a criterion that at least prevents purely conventional kinds. So kinds whose identity criteria are decided merely on the basis of arbitrary preferences. We want to rule those out at the very least. So what do we say about these cases? Well, I think that we can find a formulation of the mind independence criterion that can accommodate these cases, or can enable us to make the distinctions that are required here. But various authors have, of course, examined this question before, like I mentioned before, Franklin Hall, Khalidi Arachevsky. But I think Khalidi's is the clearest of these candidates as well. And you can see there 4 candidate ways that Khalidi starts out with as potential ways to formulate the mind independence criterion. Now, remember, he is critical himself of all of these, actually. So he doesn't think that the mind independence criterion will work, but he does helpfully clarify these different kinds of ways to understand it. So the first one here, mind dependence of the kind versus its instances, is quite easy to understand. The idea is just that the individual members of a natural kind, its instances, could be mind independent, but the kind itself could be still mind independent. Sorry, mixed the words there. So Einsteinium, for instance, this transuranic natural kind, which is very short-lived, will satisfy 1, because the kind itself could still be considered, in an important sense, mind independent, even if the specific Einsteinium atoms would always have to be synthesized by humans with particle accelerations and so on. So you could say that humans are needed to synthesize the individual instances, but the kind itself is mind independent. Now, there are some complications here, because you might think that we might have never synthesized any Einsteinium atoms. Would the kind still exist? Well, that will depend partly, the answer to this will depend partly on what you think about the existence of kinds without any instances. So if you're an Aristotelian and you think that natural kinds are universals, you might want to say that they always need to be instantiated. But I'm going to leave this question aside, because that's going to depend on the preferred version of the metaphysics of natural kinds as well. Okay, but that seems like one way to understand the mind independence criterion, and there are ways for it to work. The second one, causal versus constitutive mind dependence. Well, the thought here is that human minds could be causally involved in the creation of certain natural kinds, but these kinds could nevertheless be constitutively mind independent if there's no part of their nature that is itself mind dependent. And kinds like Einsteinium would again seem to qualify as mind independent on this criterion, whereas some mental disorders, for instance, might not, because you might think that we need human minds for something like a psychiatric disorder to manifest. The third one brings in quite explicitly the idea that I already mentioned in connection to the first potential way to go here, namely certain kinds, such as these mental disorders I've just mentioned, could not have come about without human minds. So their necessarily mind dependent. Whereas in contrast, we might allow for the possibility for something like Einsteinium to come into existence without human minds, if it could be spontaneously created. A little bit controversial perhaps, but there might be a way to use this distinction. Finally, the fourth one brings up the idea that some prototype kinds are theory dependent, so perhaps money would be a good example. The existence of money depends on a particular theory of economics, and hence it's not going to be independent in that sense. But Khalidi actually questions whether this is going to be a particularly useful distinction, because it's certainly not the case that all social kinds would be theory dependent in this sense. So you can't just rule out all theory dependent kinds and think that you're done. Okay, so that's a very brief introduction to these different ways of looking at it. But Khalidi thinks that they're all a little bit problematic, and I agree, I'll grant him that. He does present a fifth potential criterion, which he thinks fares a little bit better. So this is the idea that we can distinguish between mental sustenance versus the initial manifestation of a kind. And you could specify this distinction in terms of whether the instances of these kinds require some sort of active human mental sustenance to be able to be members of the kind. So here you might think that we have a valid criterion to distinguish something like a psychiatric disorder and rule it out from natural kinds, if that's what you want to do, because a human mind will be actively required to sustain this kind in a certain sense. Whereas if we create Einsteinium atoms, we may have needed to give this initial push to bring this kind into existence, but once it's there, it doesn't need us to sustain itself. Well, Einsteinium decays very rapidly, so it's not going to be hanging around for very long, but you get the point. So this might work up to an extent, but Khalidi actually doesn't think that any of these five criteria are going to really do the trick for the mind independence criterion. And here's the reason. So he thinks that we may be able to distinguish social and psychological kinds, which a lot of people would want to rule out from natural kinds. And I should stress that I don't necessarily want to do this, but I'll get to that later on. And you want to maybe keep something like artificial elements like Einsteinium. But Khalidi doesn't think that this gives us a good ontological account for distinguishing real and ersatz kinds. So why is that? Well, he says that the problematic kinds that we certainly want to rule out, he mentions fairies as an example, they don't cease to be when there are no human minds to sustain them, according to the fifth criterion, because they were never real kinds to begin with. So he says there are no instantiations of such kinds because there is nothing in reality that would correspond to the specifications or characteristics that members of those kinds are posited to have. Good. Well, that makes sense, but that means that we are going to need some other criterion for the reality of kinds, obviously. So I want to say a little bit about Khalidi's own positive proposal, and then point out some problems with that positive proposal before moving back to the mind independence criteria. Okay, so Khalidi defends famously what he calls the causal criterion of reality for kinds, and he's not the only one to defend this type of idea. I think it's a nicely well-developed view, though, so it makes for a good target. So he thinks that natural kinds are clusters of causal properties, or what he calls nodes in causal networks. And this is going to be tied to projectability, which I already talked briefly about. But to give you a little bit of background about projectability, this is something that goes back to classic debates about natural kinds between Kim and Fodor. So Kim says a projectable law needs to have the ability to be confirmed by observation of positive instances. And Kim famously argues that psychological states aren't projectable in this sense. So there's no special science laws concerning them, and hence they're not natural kinds. So projectability is tied to the reality of a natural kind in this sense. However, Fodor disagrees, and he says that pain, for instance, and believes that P, which are mental states, obviously, they express real states, he says, about which all the available evidence suggests that there are real laws. So they would be projectable as well if that's the case. Okay, so this goes back to classic views, but Khalidi himself, and this goes back to the fairy example, has a much more intricate view about this. And this is a long quote, but I want to read it in its entirety because I think it captures a couple of important things about this debate. So he says, if I want to know whether there is a real kind, fairy, I'm primarily concerned with the question as to whether there is a group of individuals, all of whom share such properties as smallness of stature, area of flight, disposition to live in woodlands, ability to perform magic, and so on. They may not have all the exact same set of causal properties, but there must be enough similarity among them to participate in the same or similar causal processes. Accordingly, the categories that correspond to these kinds are projectable, feature inductive inferences, and figure in scientific explanations, whether in the natural or social sciences. And it's really the ending of this passage that is important in tying this together in the tradition that Kim and Fodor already started out with. So projectability, featuring in inductive inferences, figuring in scientific explanations. These are the important criteria for figuring out whether something like a fairy could be a real kind, not the properties that the fairies have, and not the clustering of those properties as such. So this is moving away from the mind independence criteria. Now that all sounds fair enough, but we may have some trouble if we try to apply this type of idea, the causal criterion really tied to projectability systematically. So here's an imaginary example for you, and let's see how the criteria fare. So consider what I'm calling Cornwall rocks, or xerox for short. This is based on a loose set of aesthetic criteria, loose set of aesthetic properties, such as relative roundness and reddish hue. So I decide that I want to collect these Cornwall rocks or xerox, and I have two criteria. They have to be either relatively round or have this sort of reddish hue. And the sample here seems to satisfy both of these. But the only necessary property actually that these xerox have is that these rocks are to be found on a specific beach in Cornwall. So it doesn't matter how they ended up there, and they only have to be either round or relatively round or reddish. So I'm hoping that none of you think that these are a very plausible candidate for a natural kind. If you do, then we're not off to a good start, because I've just made this kind up, and I should stress that I haven't actually collected any of these rocks, but I will try to when I next go to Cornwall. Now, do these xerox qualify on Khalidi's criteria? Well, you might think that they're not going to, because they don't feature in very many projectable laws or indeed any scientific theories. But you can actually predict whether a given rock is suitable for my rock collection based on its location and its properties. It just has to come from the beach in Cornwall and have one or the other of these properties that I mentioned. So there is a manner of projectability involved here. But if you don't think that this is enough, then we can easily modify the case a little bit. I might decide that I'm never going to collect enough of these rocks on my own. So I offer to give anyone a free beer who gives me one of these rocks from Cornwall. And once the words gets around, a lot of people from Cornwall might come knocking at my door in hope of exchanging one of these rocks for free beer. So a line forms up, and the beer taps are open. If this becomes a suitably popular phenomenon, then perhaps it ends up in the local papers. Perhaps anthropologists are going to be interested in this projectable law about the connection between one's desire to quench thirst with free beer and these rocks from Cornwall. Well, maybe a made-up case, but you can easily come up with examples like this if you want to. Of course, Khalidi is aware that this type of problem may come up, and he compares not a zero case, but similar cases with something like race and witch, which are the face of it, problematic categories. However, Khalidi thinks that even a kind or a classification like which was actually a real social kind, in the same way that race is a real social kind now, not a biological kind, I should stress, but a social kind. And similarly, race might cease to be a real kind at some point in the same way that witches have ceased to be a real kind. Now, why were witches a real kind? Because there were projectable laws that you could, social laws that is, that you could come up with that would more or less reliably predict people's behavior when they're being associated with these supernatural properties that witches would have been associated with. And of course, there's plenty of research about this sort of history. Now, one thing to ask here, is this really the result that we wanted? Did we want witches and race to be natural kinds? I sure didn't, but they are social kinds, of course, that should be stressed here. But nevertheless, it seems like it's a very loose criterion for natural kinds if things like witch and race end up being accepted. And indeed, maybe xerox would qualify as well. Or if they don't, what exactly differentiates these cases like race and witch from my xerox? If you think that race and witch are plausible natural kinds, then why not my xerox? Well, Khalidi has a passage that seems to answer this very question. He says, the difference would seem to be based on how widespread the effects are and how robust, long-lasting, and entrenched the causal profile of the kind in question. So if the category in question only affects the behavior of a single person, leading to minimal social influence, then there's little reason to regard it as a social kind. So no matter how beautiful I think that my xerox are, if it's just me who's collecting them, they won't count as a natural kind or social kind. But once I introduce the free beer and I get enough people involved, and if this goes on for years and years, then at some point, they're going to become an entrenched kind, it seems. So where's the limit here? That's the question. Now, I should add that the move that Khalidi makes here, bringing in entrenchment and this type of robustness, is not a novel move. It has been proposed before as a criterion for reality for kinds, for instance, by Louis Antony, and also in this recent paper by Arachevsky, he makes a very similar move. So it's a popular way to approach this issue. But my worry is that even spurious kinds like tooth fairy, perhaps, would seem to qualify here. So I'm going to leave that at that for now, although I'm going to return to this issue. But I'm going to propose instead this positive view that I want to bring onto the table, which I think handles these sort of cases better. And that is to say that there's still some mileage in this mind independence criterion if we consider it to concern the unification principles for natural kinds rather than the kinds as such. And I already mentioned that the HPC theory could actually be regarded as an example of this. But I should note that Boyd himself might disagree about this, because interestingly, he as well opposes the mind independence criterion quite sternly. So here's a quote from a famous paper by Boyd. He says, "The naturalness of a natural kind is a matter of the contribution that reference to it makes to the satisfaction of the accommodation demands of a disciplinary matrix in the context of a system of a compositional linguistic resources for the representation of phenomena." Now, this is a famous idea of accommodationism that Boyd develops, and this relation of accommodation holds between conceptual and classificatory practices and causal structures. So basically, he's referring to inductive success and explanation in scientific contexts. So very similar to the story that we got from Khalidi, actually, and indeed from Arachevsky. And Boyd also explicitly drops the mind independence, or what he calls independence of practice, from the account, and argues that the reality of a natural kind is not a matter of it not being the result of human conception or practice. So it's going to end up being I think, a type of anti-realist view about kinds. So I would regard Boyd as an anti-realist about kinds on this conception, or conventionalist, if you like. Now, put that aside. The HPC theory is in any case unlikely to apply to all natural kinds, because it was explicitly designed to apply to biological context, although people have, of course, tried to expand on it. Catherine Hawley and Alexander Bird actually tried to apply it across the board, but whether they succeeded is another question. Now, you might ask even if the causal mechanisms postulated by HPC are one potential example of the unification principle, what others could there be? Well, it turns out to be actually quite difficult to answer that question because in a lot of cases, I don't think that we know very much about the relevant science, especially when we get to more fundamental natural kinds. But perhaps the various laws of nature that are responsible for clustering of properties at low levels could be regarded as a type of mechanism in the sense of the unification principle as well. So something like electromagnetic interaction could perhaps be considered as a unification principle on this line of thought. And there are cases, of course, of very fundamental kinds like electron that I already mentioned. And there, this question of the unification of the properties of the kinds, of the members of the kinds, is a notoriously difficult question. So we see a few people, Khalidi also gestures towards this direction, but Andrew Chakravarti defends this explicitly. He says that fundamental natural kinds unify their properties as a matter of brute fact. So the mass, charge, and spin of an electron, the core properties of an electron, are unified as a matter of brute fact on some of these suggestions. But I think that it's a mistake to conclude that there's no unification principle, that we have to appeal to brute facts just because some cases of unification look to us that like this. So just because we can't find a lower level mechanism essentially to unify these properties of a fundamental kind. And in fact, this is another reason I think to reconsider some of these causal criteria of reality for kinds, because you just can't keep it going when you get to fundamental kinds. Okay, so it's another matter altogether whether we are in a position to know epistemically what the relevant principle is in a case like the case of electron, for instance. But just because we haven't found one yet doesn't mean that there isn't one. Okay, but again, I'm not going to try to develop a particularly detailed account of the unification principles here. I'm just interested in applying them as a criterion of objectivity of kinds in this occasion. So let's get back to the higher level kinds where we can say a little bit more. And you might want to know what the unification principles could be for some of these higher level kinds, some of the kinds that I've already talked about, psychological or social kinds. So as I said, I don't think that there's any reason to rule them out as candidate natural kinds, even if I am myself a little bit skeptical about many of these cases. But there's no reason that there couldn't be an objective unification principle for such kinds, even if some cases certainly lack them. So take again the case of tooth fairy. Now, the properties of the causal profile associated with tooth fairies is based on storytelling, stories that we tell children. But there are some projectable laws about this. If you put your tooth under your pillow, money comes your way. So that's a pretty nice and a robust causal profile, exchanging teeth for money. So I would say that there is a fairly robust and entrenched causal profile that may be associated with tooth fairy. This is a tradition that has gone on for decades and decades, and it's certainly entrenched enough to be of interest to anthropologists. I actually found a book by someone called Wells on the making of an icon, the tooth fairy in North American folklore and popular culture. Well, this is an article actually. So anthropologists have written scientific articles about the tooth fairy. So it seems like an entrenched part of our culture, and there are some projectable laws associated with it as well. But that causal profile, quite clearly, is not held together by anything real. So take those properties that Khalidi listed for other types of fairies, any properties that we list for tooth fairy wouldn't be properties of the tooth fairy. They would be properties of human storytelling, perhaps, and these sort of cultural traditions, right? So the tooth fairy itself could just as well have a very different causal profile, and indeed we could associate it with not with the exchange of teeth for money, but the exchange of teeth for candy. Why not? So what the case of tooth fairy lacks is a certain kind of robustness, but it's not the kind of robustness that Khalidi was talking about. It doesn't seem. It rather lacks modal or counterfactual robustness, because the causal profile that it has is thoroughly contingent, and I would say arbitrary. Now, this brings us to an important distinction between contingency and arbitrariness. So just because something is contingent, has a contingent causal profile, that doesn't imply that it's arbitrary, right? So the case of biological species might be a case in point, although it's a problematic case in itself. But of course, the members of the biological species could vary in terms of their individual properties quite radically. So that famously, there isn't sort of a reliable set of properties for members of biological species that we could use to make reliable projections. However, I think that there's still going to be heuristic value for this type of idea, this type of measure of robustness, if you like. So as the level of contingency increases, it does seem that the risk of arbitrariness increases with it. So even if the causal profile of the tooth fairy is not completely arbitrary, because it's related to storytelling and indeed influenced by our own psychology, there's still going to be a fairly high level of arbitrariness associated with it. So any robustness that we can find here regarding the tooth fairy will ultimately be explained by the supposed robustness of these more fundamental features, such as the features of human psychology associated with storytelling and so on, whatever the story is going to be. So if you like, we can reduce the kind tooth fairy to these more fundamental features. Okay, now we are, of course, given this issue, faced with the very difficult choice of drawing a line. How much robustness is enough and how much contingency is too much? So where do we draw the line between the real kinds and the ersatz kinds, if you like, on this sort of principle? Well, luckily, I'm not going to be facing this problem on the proposed account, because robustness is merely a heuristic on this account. It's merely an epistemic criterion. So it provides only prima facie evidence for the reality of a kind. That's not what determines the reality of a kind, how much contingency is involved. The kind is real if there's a mind-independent objective unification principles that unifies its properties, right? So we shouldn't use just this idea of arbitrariness or relative robustness as a measure of reality, if you like. And we can apply this strategy again to cases like witches or race. Same kind of strategy applies. So these sort of classifications, they may be useful, they may be projectable, they may be harmful, as these sort of cases certainly were. But any projectability that is associated with them is ultimately going to be an epistemic criteria. So that's not a reliable guide to real kinds. Their utility in science is not going to give us an objective criterion. So rather we should be focusing on what is unifying the supposed properties of these kinds. All right, let me give you one more example, and this is, I think, a more sort of, a live example, if you like, a case which I think we could use to apply this idea of unification principle for kinds and make some progress in the relevant metaphysics for natural kinds. So depression, notoriously difficult case, and it may seem to obviously lack an objective unification principle. It's defined in DSM-5 on the basis of psychological and somatic symptoms, as opposed to their causes. And it's further specified that if it's caused by something like substance abuse or some sort of other medical condition, then that's not a case of depression as such. I mean, there can be an option of depression, obviously, but depression isn't defined in terms of this. So there are going to be the definition in DSM-5 says that a depressed individual must be experiencing 5 or more of the 8 symptoms that they list. These are things like suicidal thoughts, depressed mood, and they must be going on during a 2-week period. And at least one of the symptoms should be either depressed mood or loss of interest or pleasure. So a fairly high level of arbitrariness, you might think. But nevertheless, there's certainly some projectability and there's some robustness involved as well. Now, the question is there an objective method of unification that underlies the mutual occurrence of these symptoms? Well, that's difficult to say because depression is very difficult to diagnose in the first place, and we do not truly know all of its causes, right? So if we are unable to identify the method of this sort of unification principle for it, then we are not going to be in a position to determine whether it is a real natural kind or not. That's not going to be determined just by its use in science and psychology, for instance. So it may be best to remain agnostic. Depression could end up being similar to race or which, in that the causal profile associated with it is ultimately based on convention. We're just grouping together these various symptoms and giving this fairly arbitrary criterion for them have to be going on for 2 weeks and so on. Or it could turn out that there's what we might call a narrower or more fundamental natural kind, or several of them, that are just jumbled together into depression. And these narrower kinds could be genuine natural kinds, right? We just don't know. Here we might draw a potentially useful analogy with the case of syndrome versus a disease. So a syndrome is a collection of symptoms which may or may not be attributable to a disease, and usually they wouldn't have a general, you wouldn't have a clear known causal basis. I mean, sometimes there might be a clear causal basis, but we just don't know what it is, and that's why we classify something as a syndrome. But there might not be any real causal basis for it. It might just be a fairly arbitrary set of properties, set of symptoms that come together. Whereas a disease typically has a known set of symptoms, and these can reliably attribute it to a disease and often have a clear causal basis. It could be a pathogenic, it could be hereditary, or it could be something else. Now, what we want to know is whether there is a singular disease behind a set of correlated symptoms, and that's just like what we want to know in the case of depression as well, and indeed any of these cases. We want to know whether there's a singular natural kind that unifies a cluster of properties in terms of a objective unification principle. And this unification principle, if we find it, is going to give us the highest level of robustness, if you like. Okay, so that's the useful thing that we can do with unification principles when we do find them, and that gives us more abilities to predict and more reliable predictions as well. So we might be missing out on those cases in the case of depression, for instance, if we stop searching for a unified cause for these symptoms. Okay, so I can conclude. I think I'm doing okay on time. I hope so. And the thought here can be summarized quite simply, really. And the idea is that just because a classification may be based on some sort of a mind-dependent unification principle, naturally doesn't mean that it couldn't be useful or couldn't track some sort of causal structures, right? We can have these sort of nodes in causal networks that we can track in terms of projectable laws, but that's never going to give us an objective, robust criterion for the reality of kinds because of these borderline cases that I've pointed out. So a classification or associated set of properties, it may satisfy some sort of looser sense of cohesion or unity, say given a particular epistemic goal, but that's not going to be a metaphysical criterion of reality, quite obviously. So the result would be that some kinds may be mind dependent, and that's not a problem, but then there won't be natural kinds on this type of account. But it is important that we recognize when a clustering of properties is reified as a kind, and that is being picked up on the basis of some sort of epistemic interest. So that's a problem if we try to reify something as a kind where it is not, because we may be missing out on a more fundamental explanation, if you like, for something. And I think that the case of depression might be an interesting example of that. I think I'll conclude there. There's more on these themes in a book that's coming out in January on unity of science in the Cambridge Elements series. So get your hands on that when it comes out if you'd like to read more on this. Thanks very much.